Hello, I'm Chris Rowley. I'm the Principal Strategic Planner at Network Rail for London and the South East. And I'm going to briefly take you through our response to the Airports Commission report. I'm going to split it into a very brief summary of where we are in terms of London and the South East for our general planning activity. And I'm then going to speak briefly about the three key corridors into Heathrow from our perspective. So those from the west and the east into Paddington and from the south. And just give you an update on where we are in the work that we've done over the last 2 years. Very briefly, for those of you who aren't aware, Network Rail is responsible along with the industry for short, medium and long-term planning for the railway, and we recently produced draft planning documents for the Great Western area, so the area immediately adjacent to Heathrow, what we call our Wessex area, which is the area south of Heathrow that encompasses a large part of Surrey and Hampshire, and finally the Sussex area, which obviously is very germane to the considerations around Gatwick Airport. And each of those routes has been published in draft already. Just some really quick background context, which kind of really builds already on what Richard has said. For the railway industry at the moment, we are dealing with unprecedented growth. 1.6 billion passenger journeys last financial year, and we're now about 70% up on just 13 years ago, which is a huge extra number of people. As most of you are aware, in London South East, that's putting incredible pressure on our peaks, our 2-3 hour peaks. And the world we're in now is very different to the world in the past, where in days gone by, fares were often used to control the number of people wanting to travel in the peak. There's quite clear situation now where that's not the case. So we have had very strong growth, and we are expecting strong growth going forward. The other key point I think to make there is the proportion of airport traffic within our peaks. So what drives most of our investment on the railway tends to be the commuters, simply because if you look at the numbers, if you take the Brighton Main Line, for example, in terms of Gatwick, between 2 and 4% of our peak morning load is airport passengers, would you believe it? Heathrow, even with an additional runway, we reckon it's somewhere between 8 and 10% of passengers travelling into central London on overground rail services would actually be airport passengers. So the airports are really critical for the railway, but they're quite a small part of the overall challenge that we're dealing with at the moment. Just to summarise quickly what's going on in terms of Heathrow in this control period. So our control periods run for 5 years, that's 2014 to 2019. We are obviously investing in terms of Crossrail, and we've just put a new flyover in at a place called Stockley on the approaches to the airport, which deconflicts train movements in that area, a really important piece of investment, and that paves the way for Crossrail to come into place in a few years' time. So there's already one very critical investment, as most of you are aware, going on in this control period. Moving forward to things that we have been in the process of assessing, but it's absolutely important to be clear are not in any way funded for implementation at this stage. Following the interim Davies Commission report, Department for Transport asked us to look at, again, at southern access to Heathrow. Many of you in this room will be familiar with historical studies on that subject, so I won't go into great detail. We've been producing a market study reviewing demand and precisely where those flows come from the southern side of Heathrow, and also an infrastructure study to look at what the infrastructure options are for implementing a southern access scheme. Those aren't public at the moment, but that is work that's been ongoing in response to the interim Davies Commission suggestions, and we'll be providing that work to the department in due course. Western access to Heathrow, as most of you will be aware, we've recently done a high-level consultation on the emerging scheme for that option. That would bring trains into Heathrow from the Reading direction, and there's further work going on at the moment. It isn't a scheme that has commitment of funding, but it is a scheme that we've done a reasonable amount of work on in terms of engineering feasibility, and there will be further public consultations in relation to that. In terms of the other key conclusions that have come out of our Western route study, which is obviously the key one in terms of Heathrow access, the main line into Paddington is already full and standing in the peak, as most of you will be aware. We have outlined options for the future as to how we can increase capacity into Paddington. It involves altering some of our key junctions on the approaches to Paddington, and also some significant further investment in the signalling systems. This is primarily because on the approaches to Paddington, we actually have quite a fast railway at the moment. So unlike most of our railways into London from the south side, we have a fast intercity railway into Paddington, and therefore getting the optimal spacing between trains down to enable you to run sort of 22, 24 trains an hour, which is what we want to run, is actually very difficult to achieve on a high-speed railway. So we've done some initial thinking about how that might be achieved and how that might dovetail with access to and from the airport in the future. There are some other longer-term options set out in our route studies as well, around potentially in the future extending western access routes beyond Reading. Again, some of you will be familiar with some of the discussions about that. And in the medium to long term, what the options are around additional cross-rail services to Heathrow over and above those that are already expected and specified in the existing cross-rail scheme. In conclusion, I think we're pleased at the opportunity that we've had to feed into the Davies Commission report. I think it's important to stress that we look forward now to working with the Department for Transport on the deliberations that will go forward. We've produced work to support not just our view of Heathrow, but obviously our views on access to Gatwick, and indeed as part of the early part of the process and our route studies on Stansted, and indeed analysis on the other airports in the southeast, such as Luton as well. So we're committed to an approach where we continue to develop options for all the airports in the southeast, and we await now the thinking that will come out of government, I'm sure, in the next 6 months or so.